I have a third hat today, which is probably the most immediately challenging, and that's to be an adequate moderator for a remarkable group of panelists that are joining me to sort of set the table for the conversations we'll have over the next day and a half. So Lee Tiedrich, partner with Covington and co-chair of its AI initiative, Ben Zevenbergen, who is a visiting research scholar at the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton, Harry Surdin, who is an associate professor of law at the University of Colorado, and Amanda Lewandowski, who is a teaching fellow at the Technology Law and Policy Clinic at NYU Law. So let me start, I guess, with some basics. So Harry, what kind of magic is AI? Is it benevolent magic? Is it malevolent magic? I'm sure we all know it's magic, but what kind of magic is it? How would you define it? And in your view, does it even matter how we define it?
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas, for that question. So before I was a law professor, I was actually a software engineer. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the question, what is artificial intelligence, AI for short? And then one thing that is clear, perhaps the only thing that's clear, is that there's no universally agreed upon meaning of the term. However, I do find one useful definition of artificial intelligence is the following. AI involves using computers to solve problems or make automated decisions for tasks that when humans do them, they require intelligence. So for example, playing chess, translating languages, driving cars, are all tasks that are thought to involve higher order cognitive processes when humans do it, things such as reasoning, thinking, vision, etc. And if a computer can solve or automate these same tasks or produce intelligent results, even if they do it much differently than humans do it, we think of this as artificial intelligence. And a crucial point is that computers do these tasks very differently than humans do it. So let me just start out with a caveat for that definition. One point is that AI is deployed for many tasks that humans can't possibly do, such as spotting credit card fraud among millions of transactions. A human couldn't realistically look through millions of transactions to spot a fraudulent one. But with that caveat aside, I think that this definition, automating tasks that when humans do it requires intelligence, is a pretty good working definition because many AI issues are focused on automating human activities and producing automated results that humans would consider appropriate. But I think it's also, with respect to your magic point, it does matter how we define AI because I think it's really important to be realistic about AI and root it in the current state of art of technology. Because if we start, I often find that when we speculate about future technologies, policy decisions get distorted. So let's talk about some of the limits of today's AI technology before I'll just explain some of the details. So when many lay people hear artificial intelligence, that term, they start to think about thinking machines. So this view of cognitive thinking machines is sometimes called strong AI or artificial general intelligence. And this strong AI view is the view of the movies of AI, the C-3PO, fully conversational computers. If a computer had strong AI, it would be able to think or talk at a level that would meet or surpass humans. It might be able to discuss abstract philosophy or engage in arbitrary conversations and arbitrary topics. So in framing the conversation today, it's important to emphasize that strong AI is decidedly not what we have today. Today's most advanced AI algorithms cannot think, they can't replicate higher order cognitive skills such as abstract reasoning, conversation, etc. A typical 2-year-old toddler has more advanced cognitive abilities than even the state-of-the-art, the most advanced deep learning AI system today. And the reason I emphasize this is unfortunately that the media tends to present a misleading image to encourage the view that artificial intelligence does involve thinking machines. Various companies advertise their products as cognitive computing, implying that there's higher order cognitive skills, and it just isn't the case. So, and in my opinion, looking at the state of the art of AI research, which I spend a lot of time doing in my job, it's just my opinion that we're not anywhere close to anything involving higher order abstract cognitive reasoning. So I think that the larger point is that AI, the term itself, is a bit of a misnomer for today's state of the art of technology. What we call AI today is definitely not intelligence as we would think about it, and it doesn't look like anything what you might expect given the media discussion. Rather, it's more computers producing automated results that appear intelligent using various heuristics. So with that caveat in mind, and I do think it helps to set this realistic goal to set the policy discussion rooted in the actual capabilities of AI today, maybe extrapolating out a couple of years based upon current trends. We can think of AI in terms of the different AI techniques that are out there. And I'll just briefly highlight two major groups of techniques. So you can really think of AI as a suite of tools to solve various problems. And AI are kind of tools in the computer scientists or the data scientists toolbox that they pull out to deal with different. And these AI techniques roughly fall into two broad categories. The first and most prominent set of techniques fall under the heading of machine learning. And machine learning involves algorithms that examine large amounts of data and are designed specifically to detect patterns in that data. And then these detected patterns can be used to automate many things. So when a car drives itself, an autonomous vehicle, it's being trained using a machine learning algorithm. It uses machine learning when Netflix or Amazon suggest a movie or a purchase that might be relevant to you. Using machine learning algorithms that has discovered patterns in user or purchase data. When your email automatically detects spam, it's using machine learning because it's detect a pattern, maybe a phrase like earn cash or free that are statistically associated with spam. So machine learning algorithms, importantly, are designed to learn or improve their performance over time. And that's really the key distinguishing feature of machine learning algorithms. You give them examples often of good behavior or bad behavior, and they're able to learn from that. Importantly, machine learning requires large amounts of data to work effectively, sometimes sophisticated hardware. And the reason it's taken off over the last 20 years has primarily not been to algorithmic developments, but due to the increase in computing capacity and availability of data primarily. So that's machine learning. And then I'll just briefly say a word about the other major group of AI techniques, and those are sometimes referred to logical rules-based system. So the logical rules-based system, this is more of a top-down approach instead of the machine learning, which sort of programs itself. The logic and rules-based approach involves programmers attempting to model some real-world process using computer rules, and then the computers can reason using deductive reasoning to come to some non-obvious conclusion. So just for example, many of us use tax filing software such as TurboTax to file our taxes. This is a great example of a logical rules-based system. When a company like Intuit creates something like TurboTax, they attempt to model the personal income tax code, the meaning and the logic of the personal income tax code using computer rules. And they attempt to faithfully represent the logic of the various sections and provisions of that personal income tax code. So these rules-based approach are also widely used. You see them all over the place. They sometimes call these expert systems. You see them in medicine. You see them in businesses. They have business policies. Every sophisticated business uses business policies to try and coordinate their business activities. Basically, logical rules-based system. So overall, though, I think when we ask the question, what is AI? Most people think, however, about machine learning. Machine learning systems are kind of the dominant mode of AI, examining large amounts of data, finding patterns, and using it to do predictions or automate decisions. So that's my little overview.
Thank you. So, Ben, do you have anything to add to this definition? And do you agree or not that how we define AI is actually important in helping with the public policy dialogue that we're trying to have?
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas. Yeah, I think it's incredibly important how we define it. Although I also think AI is not the right term to be defined for this discussion. I think the issue is that you have a lot of attention from policymakers and lawmakers trying to grapple with AI and trying to regulate it for society. But it's been a moving target for decades now. What used to be this fascinating new chess computer, that was AI 20 years ago. Now it's just a simple toy that we have. And if you compare it to self-driving cars, as you were just saying, like those are substantially different technologies. But if we're trying to sort of fit them into this category of AI and then regulate it, we're going to be missing a lot, and we're going to get a lot wrong. We've seen the news of the Japanese minister, I think last week, the minister for cybersecurity in Japan, who had to admit that he didn't know what the internet was. He'd never used a USB stick. We're laughing. I can tell you dozens of stories from my time at the EU when I was an internet policy advisor, where I had to explain to people what email was, and they just signed a treaty regulating the internet on an international scale. So it's problematic that policymakers are looking at this, are getting definitions of AI. Nick said jokingly that it's some form of magic, or that it's this hugely dispersed range of technologies. I think if you want to regulate it, the definition is crucial. You have to zoom into what you are regulating, because if you don't, you would just miss out. Technologically, you can circumvent whatever regulation will be created. So it's a futile exercise if you don't get the definition exactly right.
So does anyone on the panel disagree with that? Does anyone think that how we define AI doesn't really matter in terms of how we regulate it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a little bit of a contrarian view here. I mean, I think there's a lot of subtleties, as Harry started to explain, with the technology. You look at the technology itself, and there's a lot of variations between different types of algorithms, different types of data sets. There are different types of applications. I mean, we can all sit here and say this is a table and not dispute that. But when you talk about AI, I think it's really important to look at it contextually. The rules and regulations and frameworks that would apply to a consumer bot might be very different from something that might apply in the digital health context or in autonomous vehicles. So I think, as stakeholders, and it really does take the community of stakeholders to think about AI, industry has an important role, government, academia. You also need to keep in mind what the context is, and the answer may be different depending upon the context.
So I'm on the side that, very briefly, that we shouldn't be too hung up on definition. And part of the reason for that is simply looking at how we've set out to govern human intelligence. We don't have a settled definition of human intelligence 2,500 years into this dialogue, and thankfully, it hasn't stopped us from trying to regulate not human intelligence per se, but the behaviors of human intelligence. And from my perspective, what I've seen generally is that the excessive focus on trying to define something that we have simply not been able to define in the past has served as an obstacle to actually implementing sort of governance strategies around artificial intelligence. So I would love to have a definition, but I think in the absence of it, we need we're still able to find frameworks to govern it. I should add, I forgot to mention, if you have questions, please send them to alex.cotran@thefuturesociety.org. We'll see if we can pick up a couple of questions either now or over lunch. But no matter what, if you have questions, do send them, because it will help us also after as we think about where to go from this event. So let's think, now that we've touched on this, let's think about, again, trying to see where we are today. How you think of the impact that you've seen in society and in the law that artificial intelligence has had. So Amanda, let me start with you on this.
Sure. So it's very hard, I think, to overstate the impact that we are seeing with how AI touches so many aspects of our lives. And I'm going to give a quick example of sort of what the different interactions that I might have throughout my day, which I think are pretty common for my students, for other lawyers, and for other people who just use technology. So if someone calls and leaves me a voicemail, a natural language processing algorithm might auto-translate that into text so that I can read it on the go and not listen to a voicemail. One example. If that voicemail tells me that we're changing the location of a meeting, I might go look up on a review website a couple of coffee shops in the neighborhood, and an algorithm is going to generate which coffee shops hit my personal preferences of location and good cold brew, my personal preference, and walkability for the other person I'm meeting, say. So there's another algorithm. If we talk about something that might be an interesting legal issue, I might go back to my office and do a quick Google search to situate myself, and an algorithm is going to generate the first page, the second page, the third page of search results that I receive. And if I really want to do a deep dive, I might jump on a Westlaw or a Lexis or a Bloomberg to actually do some more legal research. And again, algorithms are going to generate the kinds of cases that I see, not just based on what I'm probably looking for, but what other lawyers have clicked on and found interesting in the past, right? Those are all different ways that you can see, as Harry, Ben, and Lee all mentioned, this sort of triumvirate of algorithm, computational capacity, and data. And I would throw another one into the mix, which are the people. It's very difficult to talk about how we're going to think about how these systems are created, integrated into society, and ultimately adopted and then governed when we don't talk about the people who are building them, and the people who are going to try to govern them as well. And I think that the impact that we're going to see, and that we're already seeing, is that the examples I gave you were pretty innocuous. But every single one of those examples also creates an incredible data footprint. Imagine me doing that 100 times a day, every day for the rest of my life. Every time I interact with these algorithmic systems, whoever is behind the scenes, the people, are building a bigger and better digital profile of me. I think you said in your opening remarks, this sort of are custodians of our identities. And I think that when we think about this regulation, this impact piece, maybe the right way is not necessarily to have a perfect definition, but to think about sort of the harms we're concerned about and target the governance toward those harms. Because if we're concerned about these custodians of our identities, we might want to be concerned that today, of course, the Marriott 500 million accounts was leaked or discovered and publicly revealed that 500 million accounts that had been used for staying at Marriott hotels had been breached. We might be very concerned about the custodians of our identities when it's not just the things we know we've told them, but the things that they can infer about us, whether that's personal medical information, sexuality, and other things we might want to keep private. So I think when we think about the impacts, which can be huge and potentially really socially beneficial, it's also really important to think about the ways that the impact can be weaponized. And that's already happening against a number of different marginalized communities, not just here in the United States, but abroad.
Thank you, Amanda. Lee, how would you think of the impact that
Yeah,
AI
so
has?
I kind of approach this wearing two hats. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so definitely look at things from the legal perspective, but my background is in electrical engineering, and I still stay very active. I'm on the board of visitors of an engineering school, so I'm still very close to the technology. And, you know, the way I view this is we're really at, on the cusp of a very exciting time. Klaus Schwab, who's the founder of the World Economic Forum, has popularized the phrase that we're on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, and AI is certainly a big part of that. And I think technology is exciting and has a lot of potential here. I mean, just, a few years ago, people weren't using digital assistants, and now, Cortana, Siri, Alexa are very common in a lot of our houses. Chat boxes are being used. We're also seeing, huge potential in industry. For example, just taking one on autonomous vehicles, there's been a lot of stakeholders coming together to develop AV. There's a report by McKinsey recently that predicts by, within the next 20, 30 years, autonomous vehicles could take off and reduce fatalities from highway accidents by 90%. Because, let's face it, human drivers aren't perfect either. And, certainly from our vantage point, we're seeing a lot of, development, a lot of resources going into improving the technology, both within industry, within academia. And I think, the challenges for policymakers at the 50,000 foot level is to really, come up with a framework that allows this technology to grow and flourish and develop, because the technology can have a lot of benefits for society, but also make sure that there are, some guardrails to make sure that it's not used for some of the harmful purposes that Amanda mentioned.
Harry, or Ben, any thoughts on the impact?
Yeah, sure. So I'd like to emphasize some of the thoughts where I think you would ask what is important for policymakers to focus on. And not in terms of specific topics, but I think to Ben's point, it's really important for the policymakers to understand at least the basics of the technology. So there are a lot of terms, bandied about, like the magic of AI. And I really think it's important to demystify AI and realistically focus on what it is, what it can't, because it's not magic, it's completely understandable, it has its limits. And Ben had mentioned, you have the cybersecurity minister who doesn't understand email, but the policymakers at least have to understand what the technology can do, and importantly, what it can't do. And the reason it's important is that the policy conversation gets distracted by things that aren't that important, inventions that may never come about, at the expense of things that are really going on today. So Amanda, but there are actual major ethical and legal and privacy issues going on under AI that we need to look at, and I think policymakers can't afford to be distracted by speculation about the future or a misunderstanding of the technology.
Ben, any thoughts?
Yeah, maybe super short to clarify what I was saying earlier. And just to use an analogy for what it's worth. So, to make agricultural policy, you don't really need to be a farmer, but you do need to understand where milk comes from, and that milk is better from a healthy cow, and what wheat looks like. And these are things that you learn in school, maybe even primary school. And I will buy anyone here a beer or a meal if they can find a congressperson who can explain what a neural network looks like or how it operates. Because I can bet you 0 people within Congress can give a detailed or somewhat informed explanation of this. And I think that is crucially important, that we're looking at a technology that people in power have no clue what it actually does.
Can I add to Ben? Yes, I totally agree. You don't need to be a farmer in order to regulate agriculture. But in addition to understanding sort of what kinds of cows and the scientific evidence that shows what's going to produce healthiest milk, you should probably talk to some farmers before you start regulating agriculture. And I think what we need from our policymakers is to own, as Harry was saying, own what you don't know and talk to the communities that are going to be affected by these integrated systems before they get widely adopted and before we have an opportunity to understand them. If we can't know what we don't know, but the people who are going to be targeted by these systems or are going to interact with them the most are probably the best people for us to talk to understand what the impact will be.
And the only thing I would add is I would keep in mind, I think policymakers do know this, but industry likes to share information about the technology. I mean, a dialogue does need to occur, and there are certainly efforts within industry to create that type of dialogue.
I mean, the one thing I'll add to this, if I think of impact, is really the question of preparedness and what policymakers should think about. So Lee mentioned, that the World Economic Forum calls this the fourth industrial revolution. And the question is, from a public policy perspective, how is this revolution going to be different than the prior ones we've experienced? And unless you really think about that, you can't really prepare society for its impact. And I think there are a number of ways that the current revolution is likely to be different from the past. The first one is its magnitude. We now have 7 billion people. I think the last time around we had maybe 2 or 3, or at least in the first one we had less than 1, the first industrial revolution. I think the second major difference between this industrial revolution, the fourth one, and the prior ones is its velocity, the speed at which change is occurring. I think the third one is that it is the first time that we have an industrial revolution that really is going to challenge our very conception of what it means to be human. That has never happened before. And I think the last one, which is probably the most challenging difference between this industrial revolution and the past ones, is that the tolerance for violence of society is much, much lower than it was in the past. And so there might be very unpredictable reactions from people everywhere to drastic changes to their way of life. So with that said, we talked about impact, we talked about what AI is and the benefits or not of defining for public policy perspectives. If we think about AI, and we all know there is something different about, or it feels to be a little different than other automation technologies, and we talk about how it will impact our lives. Well, autopilots may be impacting our lives, and we trust automation in so many other domains. And I'm wondering, what do you think about what is truly different? Is there really something fundamentally different about AI that raises ethical and other issues that is simply not applicable to other automation technologies? Amanda, any thoughts on that?
Yes, so many thoughts. One of them is that I agree that scale is a huge difference. And you mentioned the global population during the first industrial revolution, about between 1 and 2 billion people. That's the size of Facebook right now. So in terms of our scale, we have one single technology company that's rooted here in the US that has a user base that is equivalent to the entire global population the first time we had an industrial revolution. So I think it's hard to, again, overstate how big the scale, I mean, to say big scale, I guess, is a little redundant, but the big scale is quite a significant difference. I do also think that another difference is that a lot of the way that we interact with AI feels invisible. When we think back to prior industrial revolutions, a lot of the key technological linchpins are visible, right? Steam power, you can see. Electrical power, you don't see it, but you can experience it visually. AI, so often we don't even think about it. Maybe even in the first example I gave when I was talking about natural language processing and the computational linguistics and the weighting algorithms that we interact with day to day, you were thinking, oh, I didn't realize that that was me interacting with AI. And I think that's true for a lot of people. The one thing that I don't think is different, especially based on the research that a lot of specifically labor legal studies professors, my colleague Rob here at NYU, Rob Siemens, has been looking at the effects of AI and automation on labor. I know Brishan Rogers also at Temple has been doing a lot of really great analysis about what the future of labor is going to look like. And we kind of know how AI is going to particularly disrupt labor, which is if we don't have a good understanding of what the potential harms are and we're regulating toward the harms rather than the tech, we're going to see the same people get pushed out of meaningful employment, who are often the same people who are least well equipped and least supported by society to get different training and find other meaningful employment elsewhere. And we're also going to see it deployed, and I use that word intentionally. Many of the uses of AI described as integration, but we will also see AI deployed against marginalized communities who are in least well positioned to push back and protect themselves from these systems being deployed. And I think those are some differences in the context, but actually share a lot historically with what we see when we introduce automation into society without a super great overarching big picture sense of what will happen, especially since the other big difference is that AI is not sector specific. In the same way that much of the other types of disruptive automation introductions we've seen, AI is also not specific, but it does touch literally every sector, which I think is a meaningful difference that also goes back to that scale question.
Thank you. It seems to me that the automation of work, at least to me, it feels more like a similarity with other automation technologies than a difference. Ben, do you have any thoughts on whether there is something really fundamentally different about AI automation compared to other types of automation?
Yeah, so I agree with everything Amanda said. So I could keep it really short, but I think another difference is the attention that this emerging technology has been getting from media, from policymakers, and how the public imagination has been captured. We hear a lot about doom scenarios, whether they're real or whether they're foreseeable, some science fiction. And they show me that there's actually a lack of trust in legal systems to be able to govern this emerging technology properly. And that's something that we haven't really seen with other emerging digital technologies to this extent. Maybe it's a lesson from not having regulated the internet in the 90s and now dealing with subversion of democracy. But what you see is there's a perceived policy vacuum where people say that there's a role for ethics to help law either be applied or interpreted, or for new laws to be based on ethical reflections. But I think a problem that we have here in this change is that governments, especially my own in Europe, are coming up with all sorts of ethics codes for AI. And they're pretty misplaced. Ethics codes are useful for professions like lawyers and doctors. And here it just seems to be like, oh, we don't know what to do. Let's just set up some academic institutions and get some philosophers in, or quasi-philosophers, to think about this problem and deal with it. So I think there's a huge opportunity to work on these issues, but I think the current approach is dreadfully wrong.
Harry, anything to add to this question of what's really different?
Yeah, so let me follow up on Amanda's point by first emphasizing what's the same and then what's different. So I really liked your point about the labor impacts of AI, but I want to add a couple of nuances to that, understanding what the technology does. So AI today, particularly machine learning, is really good at detecting patterns and underlying embedded rules. So any sort of job that has an underlying pattern or rule is highly subject to automation. By contrast, jobs that are very cognitive and abstract in nature, AI today, the current technology is not good at that. So the AI is going to have some trouble automating that away. So when you look at the current set of jobs that are out there, It's definitely the working class blue collar jobs that often tend to be more subject to repetitive movements or tasks or automation. And I think Amanda's right that those jobs are definitely, think of truck drivers, et cetera, are more subject to automation. And I do think there's going to be some sort of labor displacement that disproportionately affects the working class jobs. Although one thing, and something we need to take seriously, although one thing that I think people underestimate is, technology has always taketh, but it also giveth, right? So people get displaced in the short term, but I don't believe that in the long term, jobs will go away, which is a view that all jobs. So for instance, the advent of the computers obsoleted a bunch of jobs, like people who used to do mechanical calculations, but it also created a whole host of new jobs that never existed: the data scientist, the computer game developer, the web designer. And I think that AI is already starting and will bring a new set of new jobs that we just can't, for failure of imagination, that we can't think about right now. Now, that's a different question for the people who are being displaced in the short term, which is something we need to think about and will disproportionately affect low-income and minority communities. Now, about what's different, I agree with everything you said, all the speakers. One thing I'd add, I think, is the barriers to entry are bigger in AI because of the accumulation of data. So think about the advantage that Google has after 20 plus years of amassing billions of search results, or Amazon, all the purchase data and review data that it has, or Facebook's data. When competitors are trying to get in the market to compete, they have to compete with 20 plus years of data. It's a formidable barrier. And, data is the real secret to machine learning. So notice that Google gives away its algorithm. So Google's state-of-the-art deep learning algorithm is TensorFlow. It gives it away for free. You can pretty much understand exactly how it works. Why? Because the algorithm is not that important. It's all the data that Google has that it keeps secret that is really the magic behind it.
Understood. Thank you. Maybe the one thought I'll add to this is that it seems to me, I feel that in many, many ways, automation is automation when it comes to work, etc. I think one difference that's worth thinking about is the fact that we are, unlike, for example, with autopilots that also automate tasks that otherwise expert humans would conduct, with AI, we're increasingly entrusting decisions that involve ethical components, a sense of good or bad. And we tend to forget that AI is really a non-ethical agent. And I don't mean unethical, I just simply mean without any ethics and without any ability for empathy that doesn't share our human experiences. And that one thing we tend to forget is that artificial intelligence is not artificial humanity. And that distinction really, really matters. And I think it gets a little lost in the public dialogue. And so you both talked, all of you, some about the ethics involved, and you talked about codes of ethics. Then I'm wondering, if we really come to this now and think truly about the ethical issues that AI raises, professional or societal, maybe Harry, how would you frame those?
Yeah, this is a great question. So AI raises a number of new novel ethical issues, and I'll just give a couple examples, and we've touched on some of them. But what's novel? What novel issues is AI raising? So one really interesting set of issues, and I think future panels are going to talk about this, are subtle biases that might be embedded in AI systems. So, for example, today in our criminal justice system, many jurisdictions rely on reports produced by AI machine learning systems involved in various criminal defendant decisions, such as bail decisions, risk of reoffending, whether a defendant is likely to reoffend or not. There's a recommendation report that kind of scores the defendants, often based on AI. So as discussed, machine learning involves finding patterns in data. And if the data that the computer uses to make these recommendations is itself biased in some way, then these biases wind up getting subtly embedded in the computer system itself. So just for an example, imagine that an AI system that's trying to estimate the risk of reoffending of a defendant was built by using past police data. But imagine that the police themselves were biased in their arrest behavior. So say police disproportionately arrested minorities versus non-minorities for the same exact crime, and then this arrest data was recorded with those police biases in there. When the machine learning algorithm looks at that data, those biases themselves will be embedded in the data, and they may overestimate, for example, the risk of minorities reoffending relative to reality. So this is kind of a novel problem that we see not just in law, but everywhere, that there's the potential for skews and biases in data, and they're really subtle, really hard to detect. So that's one problem. The other issue is the one Amanda raised earlier, which I think is really important and is really, I think, a under thought about issue, is the ability for AI systems to pretty easily infer sensitive private details that you've not publicly revealed. So AI systems, so there are certain issues like, sexual orientation, disease status, voting preferences, illicit websites that you visit that you haven't publicly revealed. AI systems, one of the things they're really good at is inferring with a high degree of confidence details about you that you haven't revealed by looking at other data, your purchase history, your social networks, other websites you visited, your credit score, things like that. And this is, I think, a real underreported problem. That this is an example of the kind of problem that policymakers, I think, should be worrying about, as opposed to being distracted by future developments that may not happen.
So, and then when it comes to the usage of all that data that AI needs to consume, how do you think about the ethical issues related to that?
Yeah, so I do a lot of research into this data question because I agree with what our other panelists have said, which I really think that the training data sets are one of the things that it's easy to overlook because the algorithms and the outputs and the use applications seem so much more interesting than a bunch of data. But I disagree. I think the bunch of data is really interesting and we can think about it in an ethical way. Before I answer the question that you asked me, I just wanted to talk about the work of some of the other people, specifically on some of the issues that Harry mentioned. So if you're curious, you can go look and find out more. One of them is Julia Angwin's piece, Machine Bias, which talks specifically about a particular type of risk assessment algorithm developed by a company called Northpoint. And her team at ProPublica actually did an analysis of sort of recidivism scores that were being assigned to criminal defendants, and the ProPublica team found that there was a pretty significant disparity. And this is an oversimplification. I'm not a statistician, nor am I a mathematician, but they essentially found that it was basically 60% off in either direction. 60% off that for white offendants that were likely to reoffend, they were found 60% less likely to reoffend by the algorithm, and the opposite was found for black defendants. Similarly, if you are curious about other applications of how implicit bias can get fed into the training data sets, especially for things like teacher assessments, Cathy O'Neill's excellent book, Weapons of Math Destruction, talks a lot about not just AI necessarily, but other types of algorithms like even a linear regression that can have a lot of the same effects that we're very concerned about. And Harry mentioned the idea of this truck driver being displaced. I also think that thinking about concepts of dignity and augmentation is important. Truck drivers are actually often being augmented rather than replaced because we are not at the place where large self-driving semis are rolling down our highways. But Karen Levy's work about how AI and other types of automation have been used to augment essentially truck drivers is really interesting, and some of them include like the example she gives, and I'll try to be as charming as Karen is when she describes it, is like a little seating pad that you can sit on that will like goose you if you're falling asleep, which we should really ask whether that's the kind of technology we want to be subjecting our workers to, even if it may be on the one hand reducing the likelihood that you're going to fall asleep at the wheel. Maybe there are more dignity, respectful ways than pinching you on the butt with a machine. Maybe. But to the question about sort of this ethical piece and the training data, when I started researching this for my own scholarship, I'm a copyright lawyer, and as soon as I started learning about AI and looking at the training data, I go, well, a lot of this seems like it's probably protected by copyright law. And when I talk to engineers and general counsels of companies and people who practice, they often look at me and they're like, And I go, yes, I'm sure that an intern or someone very important in your organization already wrote this paper and it's in a memo on your CMS, but they didn't publish it because it was all used internally by your large company. And the example that I found was the Enron emails, which I think perfectly encapsulates this scale and this ethical and this privacy issue that we've all been kind of dancing around. And so I'll give you a really short overview of the Enron emails. Does anyone put your hands up if you've heard of the Enron email data set? Oh, amazing. Okay, great. So I don't have to even give you the background spiel. But basically, these were a bunch of emails that were released publicly by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the early 2000s. And later, an MIT data scientist went to a government contractor and purchased the raw data files for, I think, $15,000 and cleaned up this data set so that it would be usable, in part because the original one posted publicly revealed a lot of sensitive information about the people who worked at Enron and emailed with each other, including things like social security numbers, including things like intimate affairs with people who did and did not work at the organization, right? So those are all very sensitive things that were embedded in this data set. And once this data set was cleaned up, it became very appealing to use to train AI systems. Why? The way I describe it in my work is because it's low friction data. It's free, it's easily accessible, and it seems at face value to be pretty legally low risk. It seems unlikely that someone who is part of Enron is going to sue you for copyright infringement because you use some of their emails to train an AI system, although perhaps that might change. But part of it is because it was so appealing, this low friction data, it was used to actually train a bunch of early machine learning systems that we kind of take for granted now. But we should ask ourselves some questions about maybe why we have access to this data set in the first place. Because if you think there might be some implicit biases embedded in a data set gathered from a Houston oil and gas company when the executives and all of its corporate underlings were essentially found to be part of a corrupt systemic corporate culture and ultimately the company collapsed under federal investigation for fraud, you might be right that there are going to be some biases in that data set. And in fact, a number of researchers have actually looked and examined this data set and found gender biases embedded in the data set. They found power dynamics that play out in that data set. And that's the kind of data that we're using to train a lot of our machine learning systems. And this friction piece, and this goes back to some of the questions you've raised about the legal parts, is we don't always see the legal questions. I don't think that the majority of engineers, and in fact, I've had arguments with engineers who are like, your paper doesn't make any sense because I don't think about copyright when I pick data sets. And I'm like, no, but what you do think about is whether it seems easy. It's why Wikipedia has become a key source of training data. In fact, Catherine Mayer, the executive director, has pointed out that many of the machine learning systems that are out on the market today rely primarily on Wikipedia for their facts. You might think, well, facts can't be biased. It's 2018, so I think maybe we can disabuse ourselves of that notion. But to give you an example on Wikipedia, Rob Gronkowski, who plays for the New England Patriots and is a very talented footballer by all accounts, though I am not a big sports person, his article is more than 1,000 words long, very long. The first woman who was admitted to the New York bar, who's an alumna of this law school, NYU Law, Stanley Titus, doesn't have a Wikipedia article. So even when we're talking about training data using for facts, right, something like facts, it can still be biased if all we're relying on is what's easily available and easily accessible. And to go back to Harry's great point about saying you're never going to have more data than a Google or a Facebook or any of the other 6 or 5 large tech companies who are sort of the leaders in AI. And if you get even a little bit close, the good chances that them or one of their competitors is going to snap you up and acquire you. We have a real question about this competition issue. So we're thinking about copyright, we're thinking about this other piece. These are all these different ways that we're not quite getting to the ethical question. Even though when we think about people making choices to avoid liability or choices to optimize for ease of access, they all have an ethical valence. And I think that part of our job is to make that subtext text and say, when you are making these decisions of who to hire to build these systems, how to train your data set, how to build your algorithm, how it's going to be deployed, even whether this is a place where we should be using pattern matching and automation to potentially, as Harry pointed out, identify populations to police at scale, we should be asking whether we should be doing that at all, and that should be an explicit question that the engineers and the lawyers and the governors are all asking at every step of the process.
Thank you. So that's about data ethics. Lee, you are a partner in a global leading law firm. You are also co-chair of its AI initiative. If we think about the professional ethics involved and the challenges ethically that AI raises, how do you think of those?
Yeah, I mean, just taking a step back to respond to some of the other comments, I mean, when I view AI, I don't view it as, you know, the AI versus the human, and it's a zero-sum game where you have to choose one or the other. And I can sort of bring some examples to the legal profession, but, you know, in a lot of ways, you know, AI are tools that humans can use, and they don't necessarily replace human decision making. So, you know, I don't worry about allowing the technology to develop and innovate as a threat to replacing human decision making, human empathy. And to kind of put that in a little bit of perspective, you know, think about all of us as lawyers. You know, back when I started practicing law, not to date myself too much, but, you know, document discovery was done by a bunch of legal assistants, junior lawyers, bait stamping documents in a, you know, in some room, some conference room. You know, today we have a lot of sophisticated tools that make that more efficient, that enable us as lawyers to do our job more efficiently for our clients. And more of these tools are coming online. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, AI is not admitted to practice law. It's we as lawyers who have the responsibility to practice law. So, you know, I view AI as a tool that can help us do our job more efficiently and more effectively for our clients, but it's not a replacement for us. And that's why, you know, AI doesn't, you know, I hear a lot of doomsday scenarios about all these bad things that can happen, but I tend to look at it from more of an optimistic perspective. It's a tool that can empower us to do our job better. And, you know, in the legal profession, while AI can help us be more efficient, you know, at the end of the day, we're the lawyers, we're the ones admitted to the bar, we're the ones who have the duty of competency, we're the ones who have the obligation to zealously represent our clients. So I look at it from the perspective of how can I use these tools to help me better fulfill my obligations to our client. And we still have bar rules that preclude the unauthorized practice of law. So, you know, again, I hear a lot of doomsday scenarios, and I could address, you know, the data sets, and we could all sit here and come up with hypotheticals or identify, you know, some outlier incidents where something negative has happened. But there's, you know, there's a lot of good from the technology, and I think the challenge for all the stakeholders is to come together and really think about how we can harness that good. And coming back to one of Amanda's points about scale, I mean, yes, you know, the scale of AI is much greater than some of the scales of the other technological revolutions. But, you know, also think about the potential of it. You know, we're sitting here in New York in a major metropolitan area, and we have access to medical care and access to financial services. But, you know, take yourself for a second and go to Africa, where people don't have medical care, where they don't have, you know, transportation systems, they don't have financial services systems. And you've got, you know, really underserved communities, and, you know, the technology is a way of trying to bring some of these services to these underserved communities, trying to help solve some of the global problems, you know, achieve some of the sustainable development goals. And I think the challenge for us is to figure out, you know, how can we set up a structure that involves all the stakeholders where we can harness that potential to achieve some really, you know, some really good objectives here without letting some of these other incidents there. And, you know, I could talk about this for a while, but, you know, there are ways to address, you know, some of the data issues. I mean, yes, there may be people who are using Enron emails, but there are a lot of companies out there, and we see it day in, day out, who take the obligations to have curated data available to train their algorithms. You know, there are ways to disclose, you know, what data sets you're relying upon. You know, in some of the cases, some of the examples, you know, companies will say we're using publicly available data sets. You know, the government has a lot of data. It's not just simply controlled by a couple companies. So, you know, I think it's really incumbent on all of us to just kind of take a step back, think about, you know, here are some of the many benefits, and what are the structures we can put in place to put the guardrails in place so some of the harms, legitimate harms that people have been talking about, don't occur.
Ben?
Yeah, so the question was about ethical issues, and I'm a lawyer, but I've been working with philosophers for the last 3 to 5 years, you know, even some of the living legends in bioethics. So I think I've learned a bit by osmosis, and I think I just wanted to position the issues a little bit. So on the one hand, you have ethical values that are at play, and on the other hand, you have professional ethics. And the challenge for ethical values at the moment are the demand from corporations and governments who want these ethical codes or even ethical checklists, as they sometimes call them. And that's not what ethics is. They're trying to create a law that they can live up to, that can level the playing field for them and their competitors. So what then happens is these organizations reach out to communities such as the researchers working on fairness and transparency and accountability, and that's a great community who are delivering great work, but it's being perceived by others as an ethical checklist. Once you've covered the 3 values, you're okay, you're done, you're ethical. And that's not the intention of that community, but that's how it's being perceived by others. Others are saying, we have to define trust or define respect, and then once we understand what they are and once we program them into our systems, then we're ethical. That's again not what ethics is. Ethics is a very deliberative discipline. So what that leads to is to calls for professional ethics. And there's again a misunderstanding, because typically doctors and lawyers are subjected to codes of ethics, but those very much focus on the relationship between the professional and the vulnerable person, their client or their patient. The codes of ethics that we see for AI systems are not that. They have mostly obligations to society, and they're very unenforceable. You can enforce codes of ethics against a lawyer or a judge if you feel that they have overstepped their boundaries. It's going to be much harder for an individual to call out a company or a government that have not lived up to their ethical standards. So I just wanted to position the ethical issues there, that I feel the discussion is being taken by lawyers and engineers, and the word ethics is being hijacked to some extent. And now you can see in the last few months several articles coming out where lawyers rightfully say that watch out, the word ethics is being hijacked. It's called ethics whitewashing now. And I think that's lawyers and engineers are to blame for that, using a word without really fully understanding what it means, what the process is. So I think there's a real challenge for all of us in this room to really work with the ethicists and understand also the limitations of the ethicists to create codes of ethics, to help understand what the values are that we should be optimizing for. They're a great help, but they're not absolute.
Yeah, I think talking about professional ethics, one maybe element I think is worth thinking about is that, as a society, we set expectations of competence and associated professional ethical obligations almost for any profession, certainly for professions on which we rely for our health, our liberty, and so on. And in the field of AI, each one of us, it turns out, has the competence to determine their own competence. But we don't do that with pilots. We don't do that with surgeons. We don't do that with cab drivers. We don't even do it with plumbers. But today, anyone has the right to say, hey, I'm going to get an AI tool and I'm going to make a determination that will affect somebody's life or somebody's right to opportunity in financial services, for example. And I have the question of whether or not for operators of AI in critical societal systems, not when you're using Alexa or you're using Netflix to get a movie recommended, but in critical societal functions, there should be the development of a professional code of ethics for operators of AI. Otherwise, how do we know that we can trust the combination of humans and AI on whom many of our personal outcomes in lives may depend? So we talk about ethics. Lee, coming back to you, if you think about the legal aspects, the legal issues that AI are bringing to the fore, and perhaps legal concepts that are being affected by the advent of AI, how do you think of that? What do you see from your clients? How do you perceive that as a lawyer?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an exciting time. Once again, we're seeing the technological developments outpace the legal developments. This isn't the first time it's happened, and it's probably not going to be the last time it happened. I mean, I remember practicing law, in the early 1990s when people didn't know, there was this thing called the internet that was used by a few academic institutions, and people had to figure out, and there were certainly back then there were doomsday scenarios, and I remember because we were very much a part of it. The internet's going to be used for all these illicit purposes, and now you sort of fast forward, and there's a lot of great things that have happened with the internet. I mean, there's all sorts of e-commerce. We could go on about those opportunities, but back then we faced some legal challenges or issues that needed to be addressed. We didn't know how to do e-contracting back then, and had to come up with laws to address that. Certainly the laws around data privacy and data security really developed around the internet. So, again, I tend not to be an alarmist over this, and I just see AI as kind of the next step in the continuum of technological development, and the need to, look at the laws in terms of where they are today and ask the question about, what type of adjustments are needed, and to go about it, in a thoughtful way that allows the innovation to grow but protects against some of the harm scenarios. And just to give you, one more example, we've talked a lot about ethics and governance here, but, my area in intellectual property, we're seeing a lot of really interesting issues pop up. For example, back in October, there was a painting that was auctioned at Sotheby's for over $430,000, and down in the signature corner, it had an algorithm there instead of a signature, because it was produced by an AI algorithm. Well, our IP laws are written where they assume that the inventor or the author in this case is a human being, and it raises a really interesting copyright question: who owns that algorithm? And I think there's one case by the Ninth Circuit where they've tended to try to sort that out and said, well, it's whoever did the lion's share of the work between the software developer and the person operating it owns it. And I mean, that's another area where I think the law is going to have to catch up. Also, in the IP space, historically or recently, there's not been a lot of patent protection for algorithms with, the business method cases, the Alice cases and its progeny here. And certainly in Europe, there has not been a lot of protection. And that's another area where, the EPO has some policy papers that are being considered in terms of whether there should be more patent protection around algorithms in order to promote innovation. We're seeing issues come up in insurance coverage. What type of insurance products should there be? How do the coverage laws play out? Obviously data privacy, data security is another issue. Antitrust was something that was touched upon not too long ago. The head of the antitrust division at the U.S. Department of Justice said that they were considering a criminal investigation of price fixing involving algorithms. So that's another area. But again, I sort of put this in the framework. We've been here before with new technologies. We have stakeholders who really all, I think, by and large, have the same incentives to get it right. The beauty of it is people bring a lot of different perspectives, and I think what we need to do is kind of come together as a global community with all the stakeholders, share information, and consider where adjustments are needed to adapt to the new technologies.
Thank you, Lee. We've got just about 5 minutes. Amanda, if you have a comment on that, and I still need a bit of time for a last quick question, so go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that on the IP thing about sort of who owns, who is the author of an algorithmically generated work, that's something that we've still been struggling with since Pam Samuelson wrote an article in the 80s suggesting that we shouldn't have computers that own intellectual property because the incentives are so skewed, and we've been grappling with this and still don't really have a satisfying answer. Certainly not from the U.S. Copyright Office, which has not offered additional guidance in this perspective. But on the IP issue, the one other addition I would have is that we see this in a lot of different spaces, and I'm going to quickly go through some other people who are doing this work rather than me saying that I know it, because I don't. But Sonia Catal has written about why algorithms are going to change our perceptions of whistleblower laws, because when you do find out that there are implicit biases or flaws in an algorithm, we don't currently have a whistleblower law that would protect people to come forward, and if they come forward with the source code or with the training data sets, that could potentially be a liability issue for the person who's trying to help make these systems better. Rebecca Wexler has written so thoughtfully about the way that trade secret law plays a really dangerous role in shielding these algorithms, as Frank Pasquale has written, these black box systems from scrutiny. When these algorithms are being used to decide whether a criminal defendant is going to qualify for bail or parole, or at least inform those decisions, it should be kind of important for the criminal defendant to be able to interrogate the data set that it's trained on, to look at the source code if that might be useful. And we actually saw this play out in a recent case here in New York using a DNA genotyping. I was talking to Kathy Strandberg about this yesterday, when that was successfully challenged. And the source code itself, one of the rare cases where that revealed a flaw in the technology. And the final one about this legal piece is old principles, is due process. Even the 1Ls who hopefully are in attendance, I hope you're learning about algorithms today, you know about due process, and Danielle Citron's foundational piece, Technological Due Process, has been suggesting that we need to adapt what we sort of think of all the time as lawyers as due process, so that we can ask and interrogate the decisions that are made about us, whether or not we see them. Because I totally agree with Lee's point. The question is not whether we want to stifle the innovation. It's we want to understand these systems so that we can come up with better governance that really target the harms and make sure that the benefits are evenly distributed and the big harms are mitigated for all of us.
CIP lawyer me, but I have to jump in on the trade secrets.
Yeah.
I can promise you that if you have companies turning over volumes and volumes of source code to courts,
Yeah.
it's not going to be understandable. I mean, there are other ways to
Totally.
provide explainability than
Yeah.
turning over the source code, which is why, again, I think all the stakeholders need to come together. You know, the trade secret laws, companies can choose whether to use open source or use a more proprietary
Yeah.
method. The trade secret laws serve an important purpose, and there are other ways to achieve the important goal of having explainability. So,
Yes, enshrining those goals of explainability are an excellent example of what we should see in governance. Totally agree.
Thank you. Harry, any thoughts on that before the last
I'll
question?
defer to the questions. Yeah.
Okay, so the last question I had was really, so we touched on a number of issues, ethical, legal, and some of the, you know, the flashpoints around transparency, IP, intellectual property protection, the anxiety we'll have to not being able to look in the black box, is there any value in doing that or not, etc. I'm just, so there are all these topics that affect us, and I'm wondering how you feel about our preparedness to respond to those. What do you see professional bodies doing to respond to those, the institution of state? How generally do you think active are those who should be helping us deal with those issues or in finding solutions? Ben, do you want to start with what you see from
Yeah, sure.
Princeton?
So I've been advising governments in Europe, and it's a tiny bit here. And what I've seen is very interested civil servants and elected politicians who love this topic, who come to every event, who sit there, and then what it turns out to be is just a big science fiction session where everyone discusses what potentially could happen. And then I've criticized the approach to ethics a lot, but I'll do it again. People use the word ethics to talk about the law without really mentioning the law. They talk about personal opinions, and you get these 2-hour sessions in government buildings where everyone's just having a great time talking about fictional technologies and how you could potentially think about them. And that includes some of the advisors as well. Way too many advisors come in with a particular expertise, be it machine learning, be it law or ethics, and then can only really speak from that point of view, whereas the issue that we're talking about is socio-technical, it's interdisciplinary. So I challenge everyone that is an advisor or works at government to spend a whole Sunday and just really figure out what machine learning is. You don't have to be able to build a neural network, but there are so many videos on YouTube or courses on Coursera or whatever else, edX, where you can just get a really good background on what these things actually are. And once you do that, you actually start understanding what the limitations are, and also the limitations of things like transparency, as we were just discussing. And maybe also spend a day on really reading up the literature around the ethics of this. And I mean the literature coming from philosophy departments, not the literature of quasi-ethicists. Spend a day doing that, because you'll learn a hell of a lot within a day, and that will just inform these discussions and will make people like me less frustrated.
Thank you. But anyone else on this question of what you're seeing in terms of organized efforts, if there are, or if you feel that we are really unprepared to answer the questions that you have all raised today?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. We see from our work, because we have a global perspective, a lot of different, and good work being done, a lot of different government sectors, and a lot of people really with the right intentions to try to get it right. Maybe Ben's smarter than me, but I think it takes more than a day to get up to speed. It takes me more than a day to get up to speed. But again, I just can't underscore the importance enough of, people need to talk to each other, because, the technology is moving so quickly, and, putting on my engineering hat, the way computer programmers and computer science is taught today, when you focus on AI, is dramatically different than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So even people who may have, a computer science background, if they were taught, in the methodologies that applied to the old technology as opposed to the new technology, they're not gonna do this. So, I would just encourage, the people in government to, embrace the other stakeholders. I mean, certainly, the public interest has some very important perspectives. There are industry groups who are really expert and can explain the technology. For example, relatively recently, a group of stakeholders came together and formed the Partnership for AI, which is a 501c3, that are also focused on these issues. And I think, if there is dialogue among these groups and a sharing of information on these very, difficult, complex topics, so we can all get a common understanding of what it is, then we'll be even better positioned to try to come up with the solutions.
Thank you. On that topic, I'll just add one quick note, which is, what I found a little lacking generally in the public policy debate around AI is sort of the lack of continuity in the discussions. And very often you have outstanding conferences where the knowledge that is accumulating that day sort of dissolves. And that's what I found appealing myself in the work that the IEEE Global Initiative is doing, is that there is a specific purpose to develop principles, public policy recommendations, implementation level guidelines and standards that are very concrete through a very diverse international group of scholars and practitioners covering a broad range of disciplines. So it's exactly the sort of collaborative approach Lee was talking about, but with a very deliberate, as I like to call it, process of collective intelligence that has that objective. And I think we're making good progress there. And I'm also delighted again today to be partnering with the Center on Civil Justice, who is asserting its own role in this dialogue with sort of a like-minded approach. So with that, I'll thank you all for your kind attention. I hope you found that interesting, and we'll cede the table to the next panel. Thank you very much.